Well, and there's a couple of areas you highlight specifically, and we've talked about some. Another one you focus on is the education system
Yeah.
and the impact it had on that. Tell us what you learned there.
Okay. Well, let me preface this by saying that when the pandemic first hit New York in mid March 2020, nobody really knew for sure how bad it would be for kids or anybody. So it made sense, really, to shut everything, to shut the schools down for a while, just get this all sorted out. But by the summer of 2020, it was pretty clear, and it became pretty clear that the children were largely unaffected, and that I mean it was geometric. I mean the chances of an elderly person dying of COVID was like 1,000 times more than a 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
So, people started calling for schools to be reopened. Some people. This was, resisted mightily by the teachers union, and in the big cities like New York, Chicago, L.A., they didn't open for a very long time. And this was incredibly damaging to disadvantaged kids who lived in public school. Who went to public school. They not only missed out on learning, but schools there were free meals that schools hand out. There were social aspects of school that are important for kids who lived in dangerous neighborhoods. Schools were a safe place to be. They had a lot of the failure to reopen schools was tragic. There are still like 300,000 kids nationwide who basically dropped out of school during COVID and have never rejoined the school system.
Wow.
That's a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm.
And for this, I believe at least part of the blame belongs to the public health establishment. This is where you were talking about nuance and the lack of nuance. This is where they should have been telegraphing loud and clear the distinction between an elderly person and a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old. Mm-hmm. And they should have been illustrating to parents what the risks were versus what the upside was of going to school. Mm. And, my ultimate view is that of all the things that went wrong during COVID, the closings of schools and the inability to reopen many of them for such a long time was just the single most tragic aspect of the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned up front is important because I remember I've got young kids, and I had young kids, obviously, during the pandemic. And I remember thinking, I'm not sending them to school initially. I remember being absolutely terrified of the pandemic for them. But to your point, once we got that data, so it would have been the fall of 2020.
Probably a little earlier than that, probably more like August or so.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, late summer, exactly when the school year was starting. We put my son into a private school that was in person, and he went all year. And I think this highlights two things, and I want to ask you. My wife is also a teacher, and so she went from the public school system to the private school system during this time. And how could we have dealt with this with teachers who were scared to go into work if they had issues?
Did she go in? Did she teach in a private school system?
She did, in person.
Well, so I had a very similar situation. I had a fourth grader in public school in New York City, and it was a shit show. March, April, May, June. And I can't blame the teacher. She had 2 little kids herself. She was trying to take care of. She didn't have time to teach us.
Nope.
Teach them. So I put them in private school. All the teachers went every day. They all wore masks. They all had, they had proper ventilation. They had cohorts, so no one in the 6th grade had any dealings with anybody in the 7th grade or the 5th grade. They were
Yep.
they were one cohort with their teachers were a cohort, and they did have some COVID, but very nothing to be worried about. Look, I think I don't think you should have forced teachers to come back, but I think you could have, for instance, in the private school system. I don't know if this happened with your kids, but it happened with mine. There were some kids whose parents didn't want them to go back in the classroom. So fine, they had Zoom.
They did.
They
Same
were
thing.
actually they were part of the classroom. They were with all the other kids. It wasn't like what had happened in March and April. It's almost like they're sitting in the classroom. The teacher could call on them just like she could call on anybody with a computer, or anybody else sitting in the room. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. You could have done that with teachers. You could have allowed teachers to. You could have had a TV screen, and the teacher could teach from there. And you could have had a young teacher's aide who could be in the classroom and help out. I mean, there are ways to do this if you think about it.
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, well, we have the system that we have, and the teachers are scared, and the parents are scared, and the kids are scared, so no, we can't let them go back to school.
Yeah. It's a good point, and I think it highlights a lot about the lack of flexibility that happens there.